I recently added a pillar drill to my shop, but something, as you can see, is not right with this picture. Yes, it's a benchtop drill and not a floor stander. While this certainly keeps everything compact, getting down on your knees to drill isn't fun. So the plan now is to make up a mobile shop cart to serve as a base for this drill, where the idea is to use a robust ply carcass and then fit a removable MDF and Formica laminate top with casters bolted to the base. I'm also going to use a hard maple face frame and bumper for the top to level up both the look and the longevity. For drawers, I'm going to use a 32mm system with cabinet dimensions to work with systainers, but also plan to use a thin top drawer with a matching maple front. For this cart, you only need a little over half a sheet of birch ply. You could try using 15mm ply, but if you're going to be using this cart as a base for a benchtop machine like I was, then 18mm ply is probably the better choice. As with all ply sheets, you will need to remove the rough factory edges and square one corner to serve as a reference for initial sheet breakdown. In a small shop like mine, sectioning the ply first with the track saw works well. With sectioning done, you can take your pieces to the table saw and get your panels to final dimensions. Side panels use a rabbet to cover the edges of the base. We will later use a face frame to cover the front, with the back of the cabinet remaining unfinished. I used the table saw and a standard curved flat top ripping blade to cut the rabbets, where I fitted an auxiliary fence so that I could nibble away at the face and end up with the saw blade hard up against the fence. Dados on the sides and the base for the 1/4 inch back panel came next. Here I used the same flat top ripping blade and did 4 overlapping passes on each board. For the drawer slide fixing, I'm using the 32mm system, where this build was a good opportunity to try out my Festool Sys-AZ for the first time. While marking up the first side panel for hole boring, I realized that I really needed to have what they call a balanced panel. In other words, where the face length is a multiple of 32mm. This makes placing of the rail in either direction very accurate and repeatable. To achieve the balanced panel after the fact, I subtracted the height of the rabbet and then shortened the panel so that the remaining height was a multiple of 32. With the panel balanced, the front line of holes was super simple. For the back holes, the included guides were not long enough to use though. After some head scratching, my solution was to use the well popularized simple jig method, where you make a bridge piece for the track and then cut the length so that it matches up with the midline of the router. While this method definitely felt like a quick and dirty hack, the results were pretty solid. I will leave a link to an explainer video down below. I then did a pass with the eccentric sander on the inside of the panels at 150 grit. 2 pre-assembly tasks remain. First being to drill pocket holes into our 4 stretcher support pieces, where you will want to make sure that your drill bit stop collar is tight so you don't blow all the way through the board like I did on the first try. Last task before assembly was drilling the base for the casters, which I figured was easier to do now at the pillar drill while kneeling down. I elected to counterbore the top of the base piece before drilling through. This allows the cap head screws I use to sit near flush, although given the drawer positioning, if you want to save time, this step is definitely not mandatory. Assembly of this cabinet is pretty foolproof, with the side panel rabbets working as a shoulder and right angle reference on top of the base piece. If you have right angle clamps here, then the job is even easier. Although you can always just use your stretcher pieces plus more clamps to get the side and the base panels sitting square. Either way, I suggest you rest the base panels on a set of offcuts that are taller than the wheels. This will give you plenty of room for your clamps. I also pinned with 18 gauge brads, where the pinholes will be filled later. Once the glue is gone off, you can attach the pre-drilled stretcher pieces with pocket screws. Best to drive the screws in with care here though, so you avoid the joints walking away from being flush. Now we can measure up and cut the back panel. Although it should match up with the plans, it definitely doesn't hurt to double check. Here we want our back panel to be 2mm narrower than the opening and 1mm shorter. This will give us a little bit of error margin and the resulting back panel will slide in nice and easily. With the cabinet assembled, we can move on to milling the maple for the face frame and the bumper. Doing all of these parts together in a batch will save time, as all the parts share the same 20mm thickness. Given our maple parts are fairly small across the grain, you will want to make allowances for movement after milling and ripping. I left 5mm in both width and depth after the first round of milling, then came back a day later to get to final width and thickness. Cutting our maple pieces down to length can be done last, where again it's worth double checking the actual dimensions of the cabinet. Don't cut the bumper pieces to length just yet though, as we'll be miter joining these later. The face frame parts can now be butt jointed together. As the face frame is going to be glued to the cabinet front, I felt that just using glue here in the face frame would be enough. You can also use some CA glue if you want to speed things up. To attach the face frame to the cabinet, I again just used glue as I didn't want any pinholes showing through. You could also use pocket holes from the back, although this is more work. When doing this glue up, try to keep the squeeze out to a minimum on the outside, as this will make finishing easier, and there will be less risk of sanding through the plywood face. For the replaceable top, I used moisture resistant MDF and took to target size, having first rechecked actual dimensions. We can now cut our rear bumper piece and then join them together. Here again I just used glue, making sure that there was no glue residue on the underside to allow for later top removal if need be. To attach the top, I drilled pilot holes in the stretchers and then the screws up and through into the MDF. The side and front bumpers we're going to miter together to level up the aesthetics. If you would rather just butt joint for speed, then of course this is no problem. To attach the bumpers to the top, the fast option is to glue and pin, but as I didn't want any visible fixings in the maple, I went down the domino route, where I used 5x30 dominoes and a combo of the tight setting and the medium loose setting to give me some error margin. The tricky part here is marking the right position for the miter cuts. To do this, I used the domino center marks as reference and then struck a pencil line with the right angle square. This is definitely a measure twice, cut once kind of situation. My miter joints came together pretty nicely, only needing a small amount of filler later on the inside of the joint. With the bumpers in place, we can move on to the Formica top. I used the track saw to cut my laminate piece around 10mm oversize. I then applied contact adhesive to both the laminate and the MDF. Given this piece is so small, I didn't bother using the stick method when bringing the two surfaces together. Rather, just placed by eye and then went to town with the roller to ensure good contact all over. After gluing, if your laminate is significantly overhanging the top, then I suggest using your track saw to trim back to just a few millimeters of overhang. With this done, you can now add a chamfer with the router to the 4 bumper faces. I went with the 5mm chamfer using a bearing guided bit. At this point, I used a combination of an Aris roundover bit and hand sanding to smooth all of the edges. Last step with the cabinet box is to add whatever finish you like. I went with the Osmo wax oil, where I used 2 coats of clear on the ply faces and 2 coats of raw on the maple. This will give you a subtle color contrast between the two woods, which is what I was going for. The beauty of this build is that you have full flexibility to arrange drawers however you like. My plan was to install a combo of a Sys-3 and 2 Sys-1s, then make up a drawer box to fill the remaining space. For the drawer box, I went with 15mm ply and made a parametric model in Fusion 360 to try and get my head around the confusing Blum specs. The back pieces needs a notch cut out for the drawer slide, which I did partly on the table saw and then finished off with the pull saw. Box assembly is simply done with butt joints using glue and brads. After next installing the locking mechanism to the underside of the box, I just needed to drill for the back hook where I used the jig from Blum. For the drawer front, I milled up and dimensioned another piece of maple, then matched the roundover I used for the box before doing a finish sanding pass, and decided for the drawer pull to go with an upside down U-shaped finger pull. To make the finger pull, I used my shaper origin and plate to first pocket out and then slowly undercut using a finger pull bit. For drawer attachment, I first drilled pilot holes in the back, then positioned the front with shims, and then used clamps to hold in place while I drove in 2 screws. After lastly adding more wax oil finish to the drawer front, we can stand back and admire the finished cart. This was a fun little project to try out, making a cabinet this way the first time. While you could say it's overbuilt for the shop, I do think that shop projects are a great way to hone your skills for client projects. It also needs to be pretty solid to take the 80 kg weight of my drill press. Just don't do what I did and try and install the pillar drill on the shop cart single-handed. If you like the build and want a turnkey set of plans to follow, then there is a link down in the description. Hopefully this build rundown has given you some value. If it has and you want to show your support, then a like or a comment on the video would be great and it will help me reach a bigger audience. Thanks and see you in the next one.